Hello, night seekers, and welcome to Midnight Scary Storyteller, a place where forgotten tales and gentle voices guide you softly into sleep, wrapped in mystery and shadow. Before tonight's story begins, don't forget to subscribe and tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment below. I always love seeing where these midnight stories find their way. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's drift together into the unknown. It happened several years ago, and even now it's one of those experiences I still can't fully explain. I've told the story before, but every time I think back on it, the details are still surprisingly clear. It was a late afternoon during the fall. The weather had already turned cold, and the ground was damp from recent rain. Large sections of the walking trails were muddy, making every step a little heavier than usual. I had decided to spend the afternoon forcing myself to get some exercise. I wasn't exactly in great shape at the time, so I had made a deal with myself that I would walk for at least an hour, no matter how much I wanted to quit. I drove to Memorial Park in Houston, put on my headphones, started listening to music, and began walking. The area around Buffalo Bayou has always felt different from most city parks. Even though you're still in Houston, parts of it feel surprisingly isolated. The trails wind through heavily wooded areas where thick trees and brush block much of your view. In some places, you can easily forget you're in one of the largest cities in the country. The walking paths themselves are well maintained, but once you leave the trail, the terrain quickly becomes rough, muddy, and heavily covered with vegetation. That afternoon, there weren't many people around. It was cold enough that most people had probably chosen to stay home. I settled into a steady pace, listening to music and trying not to think about how much farther I still had to walk. My only goal was to keep moving until I'd completed my workout. Eventually, I came to a section of the trail that curved gently ahead. Because of the trees, I couldn't see much beyond the bend. Branches hung low over the path, partially blocking my view of what was around the corner. As I rounded the curve, something immediately caught my attention. Standing roughly 30 yards ahead of me was a teenage girl. She appeared to be Hispanic, probably somewhere in her mid to late teens. At first glance, something about her immediately felt wrong. She looked terrified. Her clothes appeared dirty, and she looked as though she'd been through something traumatic. I remember thinking she looked roughed up, almost like she'd recently been in a fight or had been physically attacked. It wasn't one specific injury that stood out. It was the overall impression she gave. She looked frightened, exhausted, like someone who desperately needed help. For a brief moment, we simply looked at each other. Our eyes met. I'll never forget that. The moment she realized I had seen her, she suddenly turned and sprinted away. She didn't scream. She didn't ask for help. She didn't say a single word. She just ran. Her reaction caught me completely off guard. My first thought wasn't that anything supernatural had happened. I honestly assumed I had startled someone who was hiding in the woods. Maybe she was scared of strangers. Maybe she had gotten lost. Maybe she had been running from someone. Whatever the reason, I instinctively walked toward the spot where she had been standing. I expected to find footprints. The ground was muddy enough that my own shoes were leaving clear impressions with every step. If someone had just sprinted away through that mud, there should have been an obvious trail. There wasn't. When I reached the exact place where I'd seen her standing, I stopped. I looked down. Nothing, no footprints, no fresh tracks, no disturbed mud. Nothing that suggested another person had been there only moments earlier. I looked around the surrounding area. The trees, the brush, the trail, everything was completely still. She was simply gone. I stood there for a while trying to figure out what I had just witnessed. Maybe I'd somehow mistaken a shadow or a trick of the light for a person. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. Maybe I was dehydrated after walking for so long. I started mentally searching for ordinary explanations because the alternative didn't make much sense. The encounter itself had lasted only a few seconds, just long enough for us to make eye contact, just long enough for me to see her run. Then, nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself not to dwell on it. There wasn't anything else I could do. So, I kept walking. I finished my workout, pushing myself well past the hour I'd originally planned. By the time I finally made it back to my truck, I'd been walking for roughly 90 minutes. My legs were sore, I was tired, and I was mostly thinking about getting home. The strange encounter slowly faded into the background of my thoughts. I told myself it had probably been my imagination. Maybe I'd been more exhausted than I realized. Maybe I'd briefly misinterpreted something I saw around the curve. It wasn't a satisfying explanation, but it felt more reasonable than believing someone had simply vanished. A few days later, everything changed. I was watching the local news when a story immediately caught my attention. Authorities had discovered human remains along Buffalo Bayou. The location being discussed sounded disturbingly familiar. As I continued listening, I realized it was in the same general area where I had been walking. The report explained that investigators believed multiple bodies had been dumped along the bayou. There was discussion about missing persons cases being reopened. One report mentioned that the remains might include those of a missing teenage girl. Police were investigating the possibility that a serial killer had been using the area to dispose of victims. Hearing that completely changed the way I remembered my walk. I just sat there, staring at the television. The first thought that entered my mind was impossible to ignore. What if the girl I had seen wasn't actually there? What if she hadn't been alive at all? The idea sent a chill through me. Suddenly, all the little details I had dismissed came rushing back. The frightened expression, the silence, the way she ran without making a sound, the complete absence of footprints, the fact that she had disappeared so completely. For a while, I couldn't stop replaying the memory. At the same time, I also tried to remain realistic. Finding out about the investigation afterward may have influenced the way I remembered the encounter. Our minds naturally look for connections between unrelated events, especially when something tragic happens nearby. It's entirely possible that the news changed how significant that memory felt. I recognize that. I also know memory isn't perfect. Details can become sharper or blur together over time, especially after emotionally powerful events. That's something worth keeping in mind. Still, even allowing for those possibilities, one part of the experience continues to bother me. The mud. That trail was wet enough that my own footprints were obvious. If another person had been standing there only moments before, there should have been some sign they had occupied that spot. I didn't see anything. Not one footprint. Not one disturbed patch of ground. Nothing. I've replayed that moment in my head countless times over the years. Could I have been mistaken about exactly where she stood? Possibly. Could I have overlooked footprints while distracted? Also possible. Those are reasonable explanations. But they still don't completely erase the feeling I had standing there that afternoon. It genuinely felt as though the girl had simply ceased to exist. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had reached that curve just a minute earlier. Would she have still been there? Would she have spoken to me? Would I have realized she needed help? Or would nothing have been any different? There's obviously no way to know. I've also wondered whether seeing the news afterward caused me to connect two events that were actually unrelated. Maybe the girl I saw was a real person who had nothing to do with the investigation. Maybe she was frightened for reasons that had nothing to do with the crimes being reported. That's entirely possible. Our brains are very good at finding patterns after the fact. Knowing that bodies had later been discovered nearby naturally made the encounter feel much more mysterious than it had at the time. I can't ignore that possibility. Even so, every time I remember that afternoon, the same questions return. Who was she? Why did she look so frightened? Why did she run without saying a word? Why couldn't I find any evidence that she had been standing there? And why did learning about those discoveries along Buffalo Bayou make the memory suddenly feel so much heavier? I don't know whether I experienced something completely ordinary that my memory later reshaped into something extraordinary. I don't know whether exhaustion, dehydration, or the dim afternoon light played tricks on my eyes. Those explanations deserve serious consideration. At the same time, I also can't completely dismiss the experience itself. It felt real. The eye contact felt real. Her expression felt real. The way she turned and ran felt real. Standing alone on that muddy trail, I genuinely believed I had just watched a frightened teenage girl disappear. When I later learned that investigators had been searching the same area after human remains were discovered, I couldn't help wondering whether the two events were somehow connected. Whether they actually were is something I'll probably never know. Maybe it was simply an unfortunate coincidence. Maybe my memory filled in gaps after hearing the news. Or maybe, just for a few brief seconds on a cold autumn afternoon, I crossed paths with something I still can't explain. Even now, whenever I think about that walk through Memorial Park, I don't immediately remember the exercise, the cold weather, or how exhausted I felt afterward. I remember the curve in the trail. I remember the frightened girl standing there. I remember making eye contact. I remember watching her run. And I remember walking to the exact spot where she had been standing, expecting to find footprints in the mud. Instead, I found nothing at all. To this day, I honestly don't know what I saw. It could have been an ordinary misunderstanding, shaped over time by coincidence and memory. Or it could have been something far stranger. Whatever the explanation, it's one of those moments that has stayed with me ever since, leaving behind more questions than answers. When I was a kid, I used to experience something that I couldn't explain, and for years I didn't think anyone else had ever seen anything similar. It wasn't until much later, after I was older and had access to the internet, that I discovered stories from other people describing what they called shadow people. Whether what I saw was the same thing or not, I honestly don't know, but the descriptions were surprisingly similar. I saw these figures throughout my childhood, up until I was around 11 years old. They always looked human, but not completely. Their bodies were almost entirely black, as if they were made out of darkness itself. They didn't look like normal people standing in poor lighting. Instead, they appeared as solid, human-shaped silhouettes that somehow stood out from everything around them. The strangest part was that they weren't completely featureless. Instead of seeing normal clothing or skin, there seemed to be something like television static within them. It's difficult to describe, because it wasn't exactly like looking at an old TV with no signal, but it had that same shimmering, grainy appearance. Their outlines were clear enough that I could tell whether they were tall or short, broad or thin, but I could never make out detailed facial features or recognize what they were wearing. Every one of them looked slightly different in size and shape, but they all shared those same strange characteristics. There was one thing they all did that has stayed with me more than anything else. They breathed. I could clearly see their chests slowly rising and falling, but that was the only movement they ever made. They never walked. They never raised an arm. They never turned their heads. They never shifted their weight. They simply remained exactly where they were, perfectly still, while their breathing continued as though they were quietly watching everything around them. The first time I ever saw one is still the memory I remember most vividly. My family was staying at a Motel 6 during a trip. I don't remember exactly where we were traveling, but I remember being excited because I had brought my Nintendo GameCube with me. As soon as we got into the room, I rushed toward the television. Like any kid, I wanted to see if I could hook up my console before doing anything else. I wasn't paying attention to anything except the TV. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something lying on the floor. I looked over. There was what appeared to be the body of a woman. She was lying face down, her body stretched partly into the bathroom while the rest of her remained in the hallway of the motel room. Her hair was spread out around her head as though she had collapsed there. Everything about her was black, except for that strange static-like texture that seemed to ripple across her form. She wasn't moving, at least not in the normal sense. She wasn't trying to get up. She wasn't reaching for anything. She wasn't speaking. She simply lay there. I completely froze. For a moment, I honestly believed I was looking at a dead body. The strange thing was that the rest of my family was moving around the room completely normally. People were unpacking, talking, walking back and forth. No one reacted. No one even looked in her direction. I couldn't understand it. How could they not see what was lying right there in the middle of the room? I kept looking between the figure and my family, expecting someone else to notice. Nobody did. Finally, I worked up the courage to tell them what I was seeing. I remember trying to explain that there was a black person lying on the floor. The reaction I got wasn't what I expected. Instead of becoming concerned, everyone laughed. They thought I was joking or imagining things. The way I described it apparently sounded funny to them, and before long they were teasing me about it. As a kid, that was incredibly confusing. I wasn't trying to make up a story. I genuinely believed everyone else should have been able to see exactly what I was seeing. Instead, I became the punchline. Eventually, the figure was simply gone. I don't remember seeing it disappear. At some point, it just wasn't there anymore. Over the next several years, I saw similar figures on 3 more occasions. Each encounter was different, but the beings themselves always looked remarkably similar. The same dark silhouettes, the same static-like appearance, the same complete lack of facial detail. And always, the same unnerving stillness. The difference was that these later figures appeared unmistakably alive. Unlike the woman in the motel room, these weren't lying on the ground. They were standing, watching. Again, they never moved. Not once. No matter how long I looked at them, they remained completely frozen in place. Only their breathing gave any sign of life. Their chests slowly rose, then slowly fell. Again and again. That single movement somehow made them even more unsettling. If they had remained completely motionless, perhaps I could have convinced myself they were statues, shadows, or tricks of the light. But seeing the steady rhythm of breathing made them seem undeniably present. Sometimes they were only a few feet away from me, close enough that I felt I could have reached out and touched them if I had dared. I never did. I was too frightened. They never approached me. They never reached toward me. They never made any sound. They simply stood there, breathing quietly while facing in my direction. The feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. As a child, I couldn't explain why these encounters happened. I didn't know anyone else who talked about seeing things like this. I assumed it was something unique to me. It wasn't until years later that I came across stories online describing so-called shadow people. Reading those accounts surprised me. Many people described seeing dark human-shaped figures. Some mentioned featureless silhouettes. Others described unusual darkness or distorted outlines. Not every story matched what I experienced, but enough similarities existed that it caught my attention. For the first time, I realized I wasn't the only person who had reported seeing something like this. Whether that means anything, I honestly can't say. People have proposed countless explanations. Some believe these experiences are related to sleep, perception, or the way the brain processes visual information, especially in childhood or low-light conditions. Others interpret them as paranormal encounters. I don't know which explanation is correct. I can only describe what I remember experiencing. The encounters eventually stopped. Around the age of 11, I simply stopped seeing them altogether. I never had another experience like it. Looking back, there was one particularly strange event that happened around the same period. I met a girl who described herself as a pagan. She was unusual, at least from my perspective at the time. During one conversation, she told me something I wasn't expecting. She claimed she was my guardian angel. Then she told me she had locked the shadow figures away. At the time, I had no idea what to make of that statement. I didn't know whether she was joking, speaking symbolically, or genuinely believed what she was saying. I didn't ask enough questions. I simply remembered the conversation because it felt so strange. Not long afterward, I realized I wasn't seeing the figures anymore. Whether those two events had any connection is impossible for me to know. Logically, they probably didn't. Children often outgrow unusual perceptions or experiences as they get older. Memory can also reshape events over time, making unrelated moments seem connected. I recognize that possibility. Still, it's difficult not to notice the timing. One day, the figures simply stopped appearing. That was the end of it. Or at least, I hope it was. Every now and then, usually late at night when I'm thinking about old memories, I find myself wondering whether they really disappeared at all. Sometimes a strange thought crosses my mind. What if I didn't stop seeing them because they were gone? What if I simply stopped noticing them? Or what if, somehow, they're better at staying hidden now? I don't actually believe that with certainty. It's more of one of those lingering thoughts that occasionally surfaces when remembering childhood experiences that never found satisfying explanations. The older I've become, the more I've tried to approach these memories with an open but skeptical mind. I know how unreliable childhood memories can be. Young children sometimes experience vivid visual phenomena, misunderstand ordinary shadows, or remember dreams as though they were real events. Psychologists have long studied how developing brains interpret unusual sensory experiences, and there are many natural explanations that could account for memories like mine. I'm fully aware of that. At the same time, the memories themselves remain remarkably clear. I still remember the motel room. I still remember rushing toward the television. I still remember freezing when I saw the dark figure lying partly inside the bathroom. I still remember looking around in disbelief as everyone else carried on with their conversations as though nothing unusual was there. I remember trying to explain what I saw. I remember everyone laughing. I remember feeling confused because I genuinely couldn't understand why I seemed to be the only one who could see it. I remember the later encounters just as clearly. The silent figures, the slow breathing, the complete lack of movement, the overwhelming feeling that they were somehow aware of me. I've never been able to explain those experiences with complete confidence. Maybe they were vivid childhood hallucinations. Maybe they were tricks of perception that felt absolutely real in the moment. Maybe they were memories shaped by fear and imagination over time. Or maybe they were something I'll never fully understand. I don't expect everyone to believe what I experienced. Honestly, I'm not even sure what I believe anymore. All I know is that, for several years of my childhood, I repeatedly saw human-shaped figures made of darkness with static-like forms instead of ordinary features. They never walked. They never spoke. They never reached toward me. They simply stood perfectly still, breathing slowly as they watched. Then, sometime around my 11th birthday, they disappeared from my life as suddenly as they had first appeared. I haven't seen one since. Even so, every once in a while, when I find myself walking through a dark room or catching an unusual shadow in the corner of my vision, I remember those silent figures from my childhood. For just a split second, the old feeling comes back. Then I look again, and there's nothing there. Whether those childhood experiences were the product of an active imagination, an unusual quirk of perception, or something that simply can't be explained, I honestly don't know. But they've stayed with me for years, and they're among the few memories from my childhood that still feel as vivid today as they did when I first experienced them. When I was in high school, my best friend and I spent a lot of evenings riding our bikes around town. We didn't really have a destination most of the time. We'd just wander wherever the roads took us, talking about school, sports, movies, or whatever happened to be on our minds. It was one of those simple routines that felt completely normal back then. One evening, after the sun had gone down, we were riding through a large public park. It was already fully dark outside. There were a few scattered lights around the area, but they didn't do much to brighten the park. Most of it was covered in shadows, with only small patches illuminated by distant streetlights. The park itself was huge, mostly made up of wide-open grass fields with very little to block your view. There were long stretches where you could see for quite a distance without anything getting in the way. As we followed the paved path through the park, we approached a small playground. It wasn't one of those massive playgrounds with dozens of different structures. It was fairly simple. There was a slide, a vertical fireman's pole, and one of those small climbing ramps that looks a bit like a miniature rock wall for kids. It was the kind of playground you'd expect to see in almost any neighborhood park. The path we were riding on passed fairly close to it, close enough that we could clearly see the equipment as we went by. Something about the location has always been important whenever I tell this story. The playground sat out in the open. There weren't any nearby buildings. There weren't any groups of trees surrounding it. The nearest road or structure was roughly 25 yards away. There simply weren't many places for anyone to disappear. As we rode past, something immediately caught both of our attention. There was a child standing at the top of the slide. The kid looked to be somewhere around 8 or 10 years old. At first, nothing about that seemed impossible. Kids play on playgrounds all the time. What felt strange was the timing. It was already late enough that we didn't expect any young children to still be outside alone. The park was quiet. There were no parents nearby. No other children, no voices, no movement anywhere else. Just one child standing at the top of the playground. Another detail struck me almost immediately. Despite how dark it was, the child seemed unusually easy to see. The lighting in that part of the park wasn't very good. There weren't bright floodlights or anything similar shining directly onto the playground. Yet somehow, the child stood out clearly enough that both of us noticed them at exactly the same time. I remember turning slightly toward my friend. Before I could even say anything, he looked back at me with the same puzzled expression I was wearing. Then he said something like, "That's awfully late for a kid to be out." It was such a normal observation that neither of us thought much beyond it. We both looked away for just a second while talking. Then we looked back toward the playground. The child was gone. Completely gone. At first I assumed they must have climbed down the slide or run behind the equipment, but as I kept looking, that explanation immediately fell apart. The playground wasn't large. There weren't any enclosed tunnels or covered sections where someone could hide. You could practically see the entire structure from where we were. There was nowhere inside the equipment that a child could disappear from sight. My eyes quickly scanned the surrounding area. Nothing. The park beyond the playground was almost entirely open. No bushes, no nearby trees, no buildings, no parked cars, no fences, no places where someone could duck out of sight in only a second or two. Even if the child had jumped down the moment we looked away, there simply wasn't enough time. To reach the nearest road or any other structure would have required covering roughly 25 yards almost instantly. That wasn't realistic. Even an adult sprinting at full speed couldn't have reached cover that quickly. An 8 or 10-year-old certainly couldn't. For a brief moment, both of us simply stared at the empty playground. Neither of us spoke. We were both trying to understand what we'd just seen. Finally, one of us suggested maybe the child had crouched somewhere. So we slowed our bikes and kept looking. Nothing. The playground was empty. The open grass around it was empty. The entire area remained completely still. There wasn't even any movement that suggested someone had run away. No sound of footsteps, no laughter, no voices, no rustling. Nothing. Just silence. I remember looking over at my friend again. The expression on his face told me he was thinking exactly what I was. We had both seen someone standing there. Neither of us had imagined the child independently. The fact that we both noticed them at the same time was what made the experience so difficult to dismiss afterward. If I had been alone, I probably would have convinced myself that I had mistaken a shadow or an oddly shaped piece of playground equipment for a person. Our brains are surprisingly good at seeing familiar shapes in darkness. But my friend had seen the exact same thing, without either of us prompting the other. He noticed the child before I even mentioned anything. He even commented on how strange it was for a kid to be outside so late. That shared observation has always made the memory feel much more real. We lingered there for another minute or so, scanning every direction. The park remained empty. Eventually, we started riding again. Neither of us could come up with an explanation that made sense. As we continued biking, we talked through every possibility we could think of. Maybe the child had climbed down the far side of the playground. Maybe they had run across the grass. Maybe we had somehow looked away longer than we remembered. The problem was that none of those explanations really fit what we had experienced. The timing simply didn't work. We had only looked away for a moment. There wasn't enough time for someone to completely disappear from an open area without us seeing at least some movement. The more we discussed it, the stranger it seemed. The image of the child stayed fixed in my mind. I could clearly remember where they had been standing. At the top of the slide, perfectly still, almost as though they had simply been watching the empty park. Looking back now, another detail continues to stand out. For how dark the park was, the child seemed unusually visible. I'm not saying they were glowing or surrounded by light. Nothing like that. But they somehow stood out against the darkness much more clearly than I would expect under those lighting conditions. It's difficult to explain. It wasn't dramatic enough to seem supernatural in the moment. It was only afterward, when I replayed the memory, that it started to feel odd. Over the years, I've tried to think of ordinary explanations. Maybe the lighting created an illusion. Maybe we briefly mistook part of the playground for a child. Maybe someone really was there and somehow moved in exactly the right direction at exactly the right time. Memory isn't perfect, especially when recalling events from many years ago. Our minds naturally fill in missing details, and unusual experiences often become even stranger as we think about them repeatedly. I understand all of that. Still, one fact remains difficult for me to ignore. There were two of us. We both saw the same child. We both reacted to seeing them. We both looked away for only a brief moment. And we both looked back to find the playground completely empty. Neither of us had an explanation. At the time, we were just teenagers, so naturally our imaginations ran wild. Before long, we found ourselves joking that maybe we'd just seen a ghost. It wasn't because we had any evidence of ghosts. It was simply the only explanation our teenage minds could come up with for something that didn't seem to make sense. Even then, neither of us was completely serious. We laughed about it. But underneath the jokes, there was still genuine confusion. Neither of us could explain what had happened. Years later, whenever I think back to that night, I still remember the feeling more than anything else. It wasn't overwhelming fear. It wasn't panic. It was confusion. That strange moment when something you know you saw suddenly isn't there anymore. I've had plenty of experiences where I later realized I had simply mistaken one thing for another. This never felt quite like that. Not because I'm certain something supernatural happened. I'm not. There could very well be an ordinary explanation that neither of us recognized at the time. Maybe the child was real. Maybe we underestimated how long we looked away. Maybe there was some blind spot we never noticed. Those possibilities are all worth considering. But even after all these years, none of them completely satisfies me. Every time I picture that playground, I remember how open the area was. I remember how few places there were to hide. I remember how both of us immediately noticed the child. And I remember the empty silence when we looked back. The playground looked exactly the same as it had only seconds before. The slide was still there. The climbing ramp was still there. The fireman's pole was still there. But the child standing at the top had vanished without a trace. I've never been able to explain what we witnessed that night. Maybe it was nothing more than a perfectly timed coincidence mixed with the tricks our eyes can play in the dark. Or maybe it was one of those rare moments that simply refuses to fit into a logical explanation. Whatever the truth is, it's a memory that has stayed with both of us for years. Every now and then, if the story comes up, we still look at each other the same way we did that night. Neither of us claims to know what we saw. We only know that, for one brief moment, there was a child standing alone at the top of a playground in the middle of a dark, nearly empty park. We both saw them. We both commented on them. Then we looked away for only a second. When we looked back, they were gone. There was nowhere they could reasonably have hidden, nowhere they could have reached in that amount of time. The playground was empty, the surrounding field was wide open, and the silence never changed. Whether it was an ordinary event with an explanation we simply missed or something far stranger, I honestly can't say. All I know is that neither of us ever forgot that ride through the park, or the child who seemed to disappear into thin air. When I was a kid, I used to spend a lot of time at one of my friends' houses. We were together almost every week, either after school or on weekends. It became such a regular part of my routine that his house felt almost as familiar as my own. I knew where everything was. I knew which floorboards creaked, where he kept his video games, and which rooms we usually spent our time in. One of our favorite places to hang out was his basement. It wasn't anything fancy, but to us it was the perfect place to escape from the adults upstairs. We'd play games, build random things, mess around with old boxes, or just sit and talk for hours. We'd probably spent hundreds of afternoons down there over the years. By that point, I must have visited his house close to 1,000 times. I had explored every room more than once. At least, that's what I believed. Then one day, something happened that has stayed with me ever since. It started like any other visit. We were downstairs in the basement, joking around and keeping ourselves entertained. After a while, my friend said he was going upstairs to get something to drink. I stayed behind, waiting for him to come back. The basement was completely quiet once he left. I wasn't doing anything in particular. I was just looking around the room while waiting. That's when I noticed something that immediately caught my attention. There was a door. At first, I simply stared at it. It wasn't because the door itself looked strange. It was an ordinary-looking door. The strange part was that I had absolutely no memory of ever seeing it before. That didn't make any sense. I'd been in that basement countless times. If there had always been a door there, I would have noticed it years earlier. Kids are naturally curious. We open every cabinet, every closet, and every door we can find. Yet somehow, despite all the time I'd spent in that basement, this door felt completely new. For a moment, I wondered if I'd simply never paid attention to it before. Curiosity quickly got the better of me. I walked over, reached for the handle, and slowly opened the door. What I saw on the other side immediately stopped me in my tracks. Instead of another storage room or a small closet, there was a long corridor stretching out in front of me. The walls were made of stone, but had been painted completely white. The ceiling was also white, giving the whole place a surprisingly bright appearance despite being underground. The floor, however, was painted solid black. The contrast between the bright white walls and the dark floor made the hallway feel strangely clean and unsettling at the same time. The corridor continued much farther than I expected. It wasn't just a few feet long. It stretched away in a straight line, disappearing into the distance. Then, I noticed something even stranger. Near the top of the wall on the left-hand side were several small windows. Bright daylight poured through them. Not dim light. Not the weak glow you'd expect from tiny basement windows. It was full daylight, bright enough to light the entire corridor. That immediately confused me. The basement itself didn't have windows like that, and based on where we were inside the house, those windows shouldn't have been possible. The house was part of a terraced row, with neighboring houses built directly beside it. I was familiar enough with the layout to know there simply wasn't enough space for a long hallway extending in that direction. There certainly wasn't room for windows letting sunlight in from the side. The geometry of the house didn't work. Everything about what I was seeing seemed physically impossible. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it, my eyes shifted toward the opposite wall. Running along the right-hand side of the corridor was a row of identical doors. Each one was evenly spaced. Each one looked exactly like the next. There were enough of them that they reminded me of something institutional rather than residential. The entire place had a strange atmosphere. It didn't feel like part of a family home. It didn't even feel like a basement anymore. Without really thinking about it, one clear thought entered my mind. This is a prison cell block. The thought arrived instantly, almost as if it hadn't come from my own reasoning. I didn't stop to analyze why I felt that way. I didn't wonder where the doors led. I didn't think about exploring farther. Instead, another thought immediately followed. Close the door. The feeling was so strong that I obeyed it without hesitation. I reached forward, pulled the door shut, and stepped back. I remember feeling strangely unsettled, but I couldn't explain exactly why. Nothing had jumped out at me. Nothing had chased me. The hallway itself hadn't changed in any obvious way. Yet every instinct told me that closing the door had been the right decision. Just then, my friend came back downstairs, carrying his drink. I immediately told him what I'd found. I said something about discovering another hallway behind a door that I'd somehow never noticed before. I wanted to show him because I was completely confused about what I'd just seen. He looked puzzled, but followed me across the basement. I walked straight to where the door had been only moments earlier. Then I stopped. The door wasn't there. I stared at the wall in complete disbelief. There was no doorway, no frame, no handle, nothing, just an ordinary basement wall. At first, I thought I must have walked to the wrong spot. I looked around the basement, trying to find the door again. Surely I had simply become turned around, but that wasn't possible. The basement wasn't large enough to get lost in. I knew exactly where I had been standing. I knew exactly where I had opened the door. Yet it was gone. Completely gone. I told my friend that it had been right there. He looked at me with obvious confusion. As far as he was concerned, there had never been a door in that part of the basement. We searched anyway. We checked every wall, every corner, every storage area. Nothing even remotely matched what I had just seen. The mysterious doorway had disappeared without leaving any trace that it had ever existed. For the rest of the visit, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Part of me wondered whether I had somehow imagined the whole thing. But that explanation never felt convincing. The image of the corridor was far too detailed. I could still picture the white painted stone walls. I could still remember the black floor. I could still see the sunlight streaming through the high windows. Most clearly of all, I remembered the long row of identical doors stretching down one side. Those details have remained surprisingly vivid over the years. If it had simply been a dreamlike moment or a trick of the light, I would expect the memory to have faded or become distorted. Instead, it has stayed almost exactly the same. As I grew older, I occasionally found myself thinking back to that afternoon. I tried to come up with logical explanations. Maybe there had been some hidden storage area that was later sealed off. Maybe I had mistaken another doorway for something else. Maybe my memory had combined different places into one impossible scene. The problem with all of those explanations is that none of them fit. The layout of the house simply didn't allow for a corridor of that size. It was part of a terraced row of homes with neighboring houses directly attached on either side. There wasn't enough physical space for such a hallway to exist. Even if there had somehow been a hidden passage, it couldn't have extended as far as I remembered without running straight through the neighboring properties. The windows made even less sense. Where exactly was that daylight coming from? If the corridor had really been underground, windows in that position shouldn't have existed, yet I remember the sunlight clearly. It illuminated everything naturally, making the white walls almost glow. Nothing about the lighting felt artificial. The more I think about it, the stranger it becomes. I've also wondered why my immediate reaction was to think it looked like a prison. Looking back now, I don't remember seeing actual prison bars or jail cells. There were simply identical doors lining one side of a long, sterile corridor. For some reason, my young mind instantly associated it with a prison cell block. Even stranger was the second thought that followed immediately afterward. Close the door. I didn't decide to leave because I heard a noise. I didn't leave because I saw anyone. There was no visible danger at all, yet I felt absolutely certain that I shouldn't go any farther. That instinct was so strong that I never even considered stepping into the hallway. I simply shut the door. Sometimes I've wondered what might have happened if I'd ignored that feeling. Would I have discovered an ordinary hidden part of the house? Would the corridor have continued exactly as it appeared? Or would I have found that it wasn't really there at all? Of course, there's no way to know. By the time I returned with my friend, the opportunity had disappeared. Literally, the doorway itself was gone. Over the years, I've shared this story with a few people. Some think it was simply a false memory created by childhood imagination. Others believe I probably found a hidden door and later became confused about where it had been. A few have suggested something stranger. I honestly don't know what to believe. I'm fully aware that childhood memories aren't always perfect. Our minds can reshape old experiences over time, filling in gaps without us realizing it. At the same time, some memories remain incredibly vivid, especially the unusual ones. This is one of those memories for me. I can still picture myself standing in that basement alone. I can still remember reaching for the handle. I can still see the long white corridor extending into the distance. I can still remember the sunlight. I can still remember the row of doors. And I can still hear that strange thought repeating in my mind. This is a prison cell block. Then, just as clearly, close the door. So I did. A few minutes later, when I came back with my friend, the door had vanished as if it had never existed. I've never been able to explain what I saw that day. Maybe it was an incredibly convincing trick of memory. Maybe it was some strange moment my mind created out of ordinary surroundings. Or maybe, for a brief moment, I opened a door that wasn't supposed to be there. Whatever the truth is, it's one of the few childhood memories that has never faded. Even now, I can picture that impossible hallway as clearly as if I had seen it yesterday. And every time I think back to it, I find myself asking the same question. If I had taken just one step through that doorway instead of closing it, what would have been waiting on the other side? When I was a teenager, I sometimes snuck out of the house in the middle of the night just to enjoy the quiet. One night, I quietly slipped out into our backyard while everyone else was asleep. I was completely alone. The sky was dark, with only a little moonlight shining over the yard. It wasn't bright enough to see everything clearly, but there was enough light to make out the shapes of trees, fences, and anything moving nearby. The whole neighborhood was silent, and the stillness made everything feel different from the daytime. As I stood there, enjoying the cool night air, something caught my attention. Out of nowhere, a large black dog appeared in the backyard. I hadn't heard it coming. One moment the yard was empty, and the next, there it was. The dog was much bigger than an average dog. It slowly ran across the yard at a calm, steady pace. It wasn't sprinting or acting excited. It simply moved with purpose, almost as if it knew exactly where it was going. I immediately felt uncomfortable. We didn't own a dog, and as far as I knew, none of our neighbors owned a dog that looked anything like it. I was already nervous around large dogs, so seeing a huge black one wandering through the yard in the middle of the night was enough to make me uneasy. I stayed perfectly still as it crossed the yard. I expected it to notice me. Normally, dogs are curious. They stop to sniff people, wag their tails, bark, or at least glance in your direction. This dog did none of those things. It passed surprisingly close to me without making any attempt to interact. It didn't sniff me, brush against me, or even seem aware that I was standing there. It simply continued moving as though I didn't exist. Then, it disappeared. The strange part was where it disappeared. It walked toward one end of the yard where there wasn't any obvious way out. There were no gates left open, No broken sections of fence, and no clear path leading anywhere. I watched it move out of sight, expecting it to reappear from another direction or somehow leave the property. Instead, after a short moment, the same dog came back. It crossed the yard again at exactly the same slow pace. I remember feeling even more nervous the second time. Seeing it once could have been explained away as a stray dog wandering through the neighborhood. Seeing it disappear where it shouldn't have been able to leave and then return almost immediately made the whole situation feel much stranger. Once again, it came very close to me. Once again, it completely ignored me. The distance between us was small enough that I should have heard something. Even on grass, a dog that size should have made some kind of sound. I should have heard its breathing. I should have heard the movement of its paws. Maybe the sound of its collar or tags, or at least the quiet rustle of its body moving through the night. There was nothing, not a single sound. The silence was almost impossible to describe. It wasn't simply that the dog was quiet, it was completely silent. It moved as if all sound had been removed from it. That detail has stayed with me more than anything else. The dog crossed the yard again without acknowledging me, disappeared into the same impossible area, and then returned yet again. Each time, the exact same thing happened. It followed what seemed like the same path. It stayed silent. It passed very close to me. It never looked at me. It never tried to interact. It never made the slightest noise. By that point, I was genuinely frightened. I had the uncomfortable feeling that if I stayed outside any longer, something bad might happen. I couldn't explain why I felt that way. Nothing had actually threatened me, yet every instinct told me it wasn't safe to remain there. I decided I had seen enough. I quickly went back inside the house, locked the door behind me, and stayed there for a while. My heart was racing as I replayed what had just happened. After some time had passed, my curiosity got the better of me. I wondered if maybe I had overreacted. Perhaps it really had been an ordinary stray dog that somehow found its way into our yard. I convinced myself to go back outside for another look. When I stepped into the backyard again, everything was exactly as it had been before. The yard was quiet. The moon still hung overhead. Nothing was moving. The dog was gone. I waited for a while, expecting it to return once more, but it never did. Eventually, I went back inside, assuming the strange encounter was over. It turned out that it really was. I never saw that dog again. Over the next few years, I occasionally sneaked outside at night just like I had before. Every now and then, I would find myself looking toward the same part of the yard where the dog had disappeared. Part of me expected it to come back. It never did. Not once. No matter how many times I looked, the mysterious black dog was gone. As the years passed, I thought about that night more and more. At first, I tried to come up with ordinary explanations. Maybe it belonged to someone several streets away. Maybe it had wandered into our neighborhood for just one night. But every explanation seemed to leave important questions unanswered. No one in our neighborhood owned a large black dog like that. I never heard of anyone reporting one. I never saw another dog that looked even remotely similar. Most of all, I couldn't explain the silence. That detail has never left my memory. A dog that size should have made some kind of sound. Even if its footsteps were softened by the grass, there still should have been breathing, movement, or some small noise. Living animals naturally make sounds simply by existing. This one didn't. It was as if sound itself simply didn't apply to it. Another detail that continues to bother me is how close it came without reacting to me. Dogs are naturally curious creatures. Most would stop, sniff, look at you, or show some kind of interest. This dog behaved differently. It didn't act aggressive. It didn't act friendly. It didn't seem cautious or excited. It simply moved past me over and over as though I wasn't there at all. That behavior felt deeply unnatural. Even stranger was the way it vanished. I watched it disappear into a section of the yard where there wasn't any clear exit. It should have been trapped by the fencing, yet somehow it simply disappeared from sight. Then, only moments later, it would return from the same direction. At the time, I was too frightened to investigate. Looking back, I'm glad I didn't. Memory has a strange way of changing over time. Sometimes details become less clear as the years pass. Other times, certain moments become sharper. This experience has always stayed surprisingly vivid in my mind. I can still remember the darkness. I can still remember the moonlight. I can still picture that large black figure moving silently across the yard. I can still remember standing perfectly still, waiting for it to notice me. And I can still remember the growing fear that came from realizing it wasn't behaving like any dog I had ever seen. I've often wondered whether fear influenced my memory. It's possible that being alone at night made everything seem stranger than it really was. Our minds can play tricks on us, especially in darkness where shadows and limited visibility make ordinary things seem unusual. I can't completely rule that out. At the same time, I also can't ignore how real the experience felt. Everything about that dog seemed wrong. Not dramatic, not violent, just wrong. It never barked. It never growled. It never breathed. It never made footsteps. It never acknowledged my presence. It simply crossed the yard again and again in complete silence before disappearing forever. To this day, I don't know what I saw. Maybe it really was an ordinary dog that happened to behave in an unusually quiet way, and my teenage imagination filled in the gaps. That's certainly one possible explanation. But another part of me has never been able to shake the feeling that what crossed my backyard that night wasn't an ordinary animal at all. I've read stories over the years from other people who claim to have encountered strange black dogs or unexplained figures late at night. Whether those stories describe folklore, misunderstood animals, or something beyond normal explanation, I honestly don't know. All I know is what I experienced. One quiet night, while standing alone in my backyard, a large black dog appeared out of nowhere. It walked silently across the yard several times, passing close enough that I should have heard every breath it took. Yet, I heard absolutely nothing. It disappeared where there was no obvious way out, returned more than once, ignored me completely, and then vanished forever. I never saw it before that night. I never saw it after that night. Even now, years later, when I think back on the experience, I can't fully explain why it unsettles me so deeply. It wasn't because the dog chased me or attacked me. It never showed any aggression at all. What disturbed me was the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't looking at a normal dog. Whether it was simply an unusual encounter that my memory has magnified over time, or something that can't easily be explained, I honestly don't know. What I do know is that, whenever I remember that silent black figure crossing the moonlit grass without making the slightest sound, I still get the same uneasy feeling I had that night deep down. I can't shake the feeling that whatever passed through my backyard wasn't just a dog. And for reasons I still can't explain, I've always felt it was something I was lucky never to see again. My dad is a staunch humanist. He is not the kind of person who believes in signs, spirits, angels, fate, or anything mystical. He has always been very grounded in the real world. If something happens, he looks for a practical reason. If someone tells him a ghost story, he might listen politely, but he is not going to nod along and say it must have been supernatural. He believes in people, choices, chance, and reason. That is just who he is. That is part of why this story has always stayed with me. Because it happened to him. One day, he was driving down a country road. It was an ordinary drive, nothing special, nothing dramatic. Just one of those rural roads where the hedges and fields roll past, and you can go for long stretches without much happening. There was no reason for him to expect anything strange. He was simply driving along his route, following the road ahead, probably thinking about whatever people think about when they are alone in the car. Then, out of nowhere, a thought came into his mind. I'll go and look at the field of bluebells. It was sudden. It was not something he had planned before. It was not part of his route. It was not like he had been thinking all morning about visiting that field. The thought just appeared in his head with enough force that he acted on it right away. He took the next junction almost immediately, turning off the road he had been on. And just as he did that, a child ran out onto his original path. If he had continued straight, if he had ignored that sudden thought, if he had stayed on the road he was already taking, he would almost certainly have hit the child. He might have killed them. It happened that close. The timing was that exact. The turn he made because of the bluebells took him away from the spot where the child ran out. That alone would have been enough to shake anyone, even if you are not superstitious. Even if you do not believe in fate or warnings, it is hard not to feel something when you realize you have just missed a tragedy by seconds. My dad was understandably shaken. He had not seen the child in time to plan around them. He had not changed his route because of anything on the road. He had turned because of a thought about bluebells. Then, almost immediately, he saw that if he had not turned, something awful would have happened. He still went to the field. I imagine he was quite shaken by then, driving with that cold feeling in his chest, replaying the moment over and over. There are near misses, and then there are near misses that feel personal, like the world briefly moved your hand away from danger. He must have been thinking about the child, about the road he had just left, about how close it had been. Maybe he was trying to steady himself. Maybe going to see the bluebells felt like the only thing to do, because that was the thought that had pulled him off the road in the first place. When he got there, he found the field of bluebells. And then, something else hit him. He had no idea how he had known the bluebells were there. That was the part that made the whole thing truly strange. If he had passed the field many times before, or if someone had told him about it, then maybe the thought was just a memory rising at the right moment. If he had seen a sign, then it would make sense. If he had been planning to go there, no mystery. But when he arrived, he realized he did not know how the idea had come to him at all. He did not know how he knew about that field. He did not know why the thought had appeared exactly when it did. And he did not know why he had obeyed it so quickly. For someone like my dad, that is not an easy thing to sit with. A person who already believes in signs might say it was a guardian angel, a spirit, fate, or some force protecting both him and the child. But my dad is not that person. He would not reach for that explanation lightly. He would try to find something rational first. Maybe he had seen the field before and forgotten. Maybe he had overheard someone mention bluebells in the area. Maybe his subconscious noticed something on the road, some movement, some danger, and created a harmless reason to turn before he consciously understood why. That kind of explanation is possible. The brain notices things before we fully process them. A driver might sense a risk without being able to explain it. Maybe he saw a flash of movement near the road, not enough to register as a child, but enough for some deeper part of his mind to push him away. Maybe the thought of bluebells was just the form that instinct took. Maybe his brain gave him a reason to turn because it had already detected danger, even if he did not know it. That is the kind of explanation my dad would probably prefer. But even that does not explain everything. It does not explain the field itself. It does not explain why the thought was not simply, turn here, or slow down, or take another route. It was specific. He would go and look at the field of bluebells. Then, he took the junction, avoided the child, and actually found a field of bluebells he did not know he knew about. That is what makes it feel different from a normal instinct. It was not just a warning. It came dressed as an ordinary desire, a peaceful thought, a gentle thought. Not panic, not fear, not a sharp inner alarm, just the sudden idea of going to see bluebells. Something beautiful and harmless. Something that made him turn the wheel at exactly the right time. And because he did, a child lived. That is the fact at the center of the story. Whatever the cause was, the result was real. His life and that child's life both continued in a completely different direction because of one sudden thought. If he had not taken that junction, the story would have ended in horror. A country road, a child running out, a driver with no time to stop, and a life changed forever. Instead, there was a turn, a field. A shaken man trying to understand why he had been pulled away from the road. I think about how small the moment must have been from the outside. A car driving down a road. A driver deciding to turn. A child running across a road just after the car leaves. Nothing dramatic for anyone watching, maybe. No lightning in the sky. No voice from heaven. No glowing sign. Just a turn taken at the exact moment it needed to be taken. But from inside the car, and from inside my dad's mind, it must have felt enormous afterward. The strangest things are often like that. They do not announce themselves as supernatural. They do not arrive with music or obvious meaning. They happen as small choices, sudden feelings, strange thoughts you almost ignore. Then, a second later, you realize the thought changed everything. My dad could have brushed it off completely if not for the timing. People get random ideas all the time. Someone driving through the countryside might suddenly decide to take a different road. Someone might remember flowers, a field, a view, a place they have not visited in years. But when that random idea pulls you away from a fatal accident before it happens, it becomes hard to treat it like any other passing thought. And when you arrive at the field and realize you do not even know how you knew it was there, it becomes harder still. I do not know what my dad believes about it now. I know he is still a humanist at heart. I do not think one strange event turned him into someone who believes every coincidence is a message. That is not him. But I also think there are some experiences that stay in a person's mind even when they do not fit their beliefs. You do not have to change your whole worldview to admit that something happened which you cannot fully explain. Maybe that is what this was for him. A crack in certainty. Not enough to make him religious. Not enough to make him superstitious. But enough to make him remember that the mind, the world, and chance can be stranger than we understand. There are so many possible explanations, and none of them feel complete. Maybe he had once seen the bluebells and forgotten. Maybe some part of his brain remembered the field from a previous drive. Maybe he subconsciously sensed the child before consciously seeing them. Maybe the thought came from instinct, memory, and timing, all combining in a way that only seemed impossible afterward. Or maybe something else happened. Maybe some part of him knew. Maybe there are moments when we receive information without understanding where it came from. Maybe the brain can connect things too quickly for us to follow. Maybe the universe, in rare moments, nudges people away from disaster. Maybe love, chance, memory, and fate are not as separate as we think they are. I do not know. My dad probably would not like me making it sound too mystical. He would want the reasonable version. He would want the explanation that does not require spirits or destiny. And I respect that. But even in the most reasonable version, the story is still chilling. Because he had the thought at the exact right moment. He took the turn. A child ran into the path he would have been on, and when he reached the field of bluebells, shaken by what had just happened, he realized he had no idea how he knew the field existed. That is not a big, dramatic ghost story. There is no figure standing in the road, no voice calling his name, no dead relative appearing in the passenger seat. It is quieter than that. Maybe that makes it more powerful. It is the kind of story that asks a question and refuses to answer it. Where did the thought come from? Why did it come then? Why bluebells? Why that junction? Why just in time? I can imagine him standing there near the field, looking at the flowers, trying to calm himself after almost being part of something terrible. Bluebells are beautiful in a soft, strange way, especially when there are many of them. A whole field of them can feel unreal, like the ground has turned blue in the shade. Maybe that peaceful sight made the near miss feel even more surreal. One moment, he was on a path toward possible tragedy. The next, he was standing near flowers because a thought had told him to go there. It is almost too strange to be frightening in the usual sense. But it is frightening when you think about how close everything was. One thought, one turn, one child, one life not taken, and one man left wondering how he had known to go toward a field he did not remember knowing. My dad is still a humanist. He is still practical. He still believes in reason. But this story sits outside the easy explanations, even for him. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was forgotten memory. Maybe it was coincidence so precise that it felt like intervention. Maybe it was something we do not have the right words for. Whatever it was, that sudden thought saved a child's life. And my dad never forgot the strange feeling of arriving at that field of bluebells and realizing he had no idea how he knew they were there. I went to answer a Craigslist ad for some pint glasses. That was all it was supposed to be. The post said they were collected over years of working on the road as a salesman, and I thought it sounded harmless enough. Pint glasses are the kind of thing people collect without even meaning to. Bars, restaurants, breweries, hotels, events, little souvenir places. They all have their own glasses, and after enough years of traveling, someone could easily end up with boxes of them. It did not sound strange. It sounded like one of those random Craigslist finds where someone is cleaning out their house and wants things gone. It was around dusk when I got there. That already gave the whole place a different feeling. Dusk is not fully dark, but it is not daylight either. Everything looks a little softer and a little more uncertain. Houses seem quieter. Shadows stretch in weird ways. You can still see where you are going, but the day feels like it is closing behind you. I pulled up, parked, and got out of the car. As soon as I did, the porch light came on. That should not have bothered me by itself. People turn on porch lights when someone arrives. Maybe they heard my car. Maybe they saw me pull in. Maybe it was motion activated. But in that moment, with the light suddenly snapping on in front of me, I remember feeling aware of the house in a way I had not expected. It was like the place had noticed me. Still, I told myself to be normal. I had come for pint glasses. I was not doing anything risky. Or at least I did not think I was. I was a big guy myself, about 6 feet tall and around 230 pounds, so I was not someone who usually felt physically intimidated right away. I figured I would go in, look at the glasses, choose a few, maybe make small talk, and leave. I went to the door. A large man greeted me. He was big enough that I noticed immediately, and again, I am not a small person. He did not waste much time with introductions. He just said something like, "Let's head to the basement." That was the first moment my instincts stirred. Basements are normal places to store boxes. I knew that. People keep old dishes, tools, holiday decorations, furniture, and random junk in basements all the time. It made sense that boxes of pint glasses would be down there. But when you are answering an online ad from a stranger, and the first thing he says is to go down to the basement, something in your body takes note. Then his son came behind me. His son was even larger than me, maybe 6'5" and around 250 pounds. He did not say much, or maybe anything at all. He just ended up behind me as we started going down the stairs. So now I was in the middle. The father was ahead of me, leading the way into the basement, and the son was behind me. That was when the situation changed from slightly uncomfortable to something my body did not like at all. I kept walking anyway. This is the part people do not always understand when they hear stories like this. They imagine they would stop right there and say, "No thanks," then leave. Maybe some people would, but in the moment, politeness, confusion, and the desire not to be rude can keep you moving longer than common sense should allow. You tell yourself not to overreact. You tell yourself you are being paranoid. You tell yourself these are just two big guys in their own house, and the glasses are probably exactly where they said they are. So I went down the stairs. The lights came on, and I saw 4 large, double-door stainless steel freezers lined up side by side along the wall. In front of them was a large stainless steel table. That image hit me hard. There are plenty of innocent reasons someone might have freezers in a basement. Maybe they hunt. Maybe they buy meat in bulk. Maybe they run some kind of catering thing. Maybe they have a big family. Maybe the stainless steel table is for food prep, hobbies, cleaning fish, processing deer, anything. I know there are explanations. But when you are in a stranger's basement, standing between 2 men larger than you, and you see 4 huge stainless freezers and a big stainless table, your mind does not go to the innocent explanations first. It goes somewhere much darker. I became anxious instantly. Not mildly uncomfortable. Anxious in a physical way. I could feel sweat bead up under my hat. My body knew before my brain had finished putting the thoughts together. The basement did not feel like a place where someone casually stored old pint glasses. It felt like a place where you do not want to be alone. The freezers were too much. The table was too much. The 2 large men were too close. The fact that I had been placed between them on the way down was suddenly impossible not to notice. Then the father pointed to a few boxes near the bottom of the stairs and said the glasses were just here. That made it even stranger in a way. If the glasses were right at the bottom of the stairs, why did I need to be led so far into the feeling of the basement? Maybe I did not. Maybe they were just showing me where they were. But once I saw the boxes were close to the stairs, all I could think was that I needed to grab what I came for and get out as calmly as possible. I did not want to act scared. That felt important. I did not want them to know how uncomfortable I was. I did not want to offend them if they were harmless, but more than that, I did not want to trigger anything if they were not. So I smiled, acted casual, and started looking through the top of the box. I picked the first 6 glasses that looked decent. I did not search deeply. I did not compare designs carefully. I did not take my time the way I might have if I had felt comfortable. I just wanted enough glasses to make the visit look normal and complete. While I was choosing them, I tried to make jokes about how nice they were. That is what fear can make you do. You talk too much. You laugh a little. You act friendly. You try to keep the mood easy because some old survival part of you believes calm people are safer than panicked people. The father told me how he had collected the glasses, and I listened, nodding and responding like everything was fine. I was aware of every part of the room while pretending I was only interested in the glasses. The son said nothing. That was one of the worst parts. He just leaned over me to see which ones I was picking. Having him that close made the anxiety in my chest tighten. I did not like that he was silent. I did not like that he was watching me choose glasses. I did not like that he was behind or over me in a basement with those freezers and that table. I was trying to keep my voice normal, but inside, I was fighting the urge to run. I grabbed my glasses and turned. I said, "Excuse me," and gave some quick excuse about running late. I said maybe they could donate the rest to a local pub or Yellow Brick Pizza. I was trying to sound helpful, casual, like a normal person finishing a normal Craigslist pickup. I did not want to make it seem like I was leaving because every instinct in my body was screaming at me. Then I moved toward the stairs. I cannot overstate how hard it was not to run. Every step felt too slow. I was aware of the stairs, the men, the basement behind me, the freezers, the table, the distance to the door. I wanted to bolt up those stairs as fast as I could, but I forced myself to walk normally. Running would have meant admitting fear. Running would have changed the situation. So I kept control of myself, got back upstairs, got out of the house, and left. Nothing happened. That is the strange thing about stories like this. There was no attack. No one grabbed me. No one blocked the door. No one said anything threatening. I got the glasses and left. On paper, it was just an awkward Craigslist pickup from a house with a basement full of equipment I did not like. If someone wanted to dismiss it, they could. They could say the men were probably harmless. They could say the freezers were for hunting or food storage. They could say the table was for cleaning fish or working on projects. They could say I got spooked for no reason. Maybe they would be right. But I know how it felt. I know the feeling of being led downstairs with one large man ahead of me and an even larger one behind me. I know the feeling of seeing those 4 stainless steel double-door freezers lined up against the wall. I know the way that stainless table looked in front of them. I know the sudden sweat under my hat. I know how carefully I chose the top 6 glasses without really caring which ones they were. I know how hard I worked to sound friendly. I know how badly I wanted to run. And I know that after that, I changed the way I used Craigslist. I do not search the free section unless the post says curb pickup. And honestly, usually not even then. It is just not worth it. Free things can feel harmless because there is no money involved, but that can also make people lower their guard. They think, I am just grabbing some glasses, or a chair, or a box of books. They do not think about walking into a stranger's house at dusk. They do not think about basements. They do not think about how quickly a normal errand can become a situation where they are outnumbered, out of sight, and unsure what is actually happening. That day taught me to listen to my body. Maybe the men were perfectly innocent. Maybe I misread the entire thing. Maybe they still tell a story about the weird guy who came for pint glasses, got nervous, made awkward jokes, and rushed out. I am open to that possibility. But I would rather be embarrassed and alive than polite and trapped. The older I get, the more I believe that if something feels wrong, you do not owe anyone your comfort. You do not owe strangers the benefit of the doubt when your instincts are screaming. There was just something too off about that basement. The freezers were lined up too neatly. The stainless table felt too clinical. The son's silence felt too heavy. The father's casual "just here" felt too late, because by then I had already seen the room and felt the mood shift. It was not one detail alone. It was all of them together. The dusk arrival, the porch light, the big man at the door, the basement, the sun behind me, the stainless freezers, the table, the boxes near the stairs, the sun leaning over me, my own body reacting like I had walked into danger. That is enough for me. I still have no proof anything bad was going to happen, and to be fair, nothing bad did happen. I left with the glasses. I went home. The story ended quietly. But sometimes the scariest situations are the ones where nothing happens because you left before it could. You never know whether your fear saved you or whether you were afraid of nothing. You only know that you got out. I think about that whenever someone talks about meeting strangers online for free items. I am not saying every person on Craigslist is dangerous. Most people are probably just normal folks trying to get rid of stuff. But normal people can meet you outside. Normal people can leave things on the porch. Normal people can understand why you do not want to go into a basement. And if a situation starts making you feel trapped, you are allowed to leave, even if it feels rude. I grabbed 6-pint glasses that day and forced myself not to run. I made jokes. I smiled. I said I was late. Then I got out. And after seeing that basement, those freezers, that stainless table, and the silent sun watching over me, I decided that no free item is worth ignoring that feeling again. Be safe out there. And if you want to enjoy a pint glass of your favorite beverage, maybe buy one from a store. I do not remember any of this myself, but my parents and my grandparent were always sure that when I was very young, I saw things other people could not see. I know that sounds like the kind of story families tell later, the kind that gets repeated so many times it starts to feel bigger than it was. I understand that. I cannot sit here and say I remember the faces, the voices, the places, or the feeling of what happened. I was too young. I only know what the adults in my family told me, and the way they told it was never like a joke. They were serious about it. To them, it was not just a child being imaginative. They believed I was seeing ghosts. I was born in 1972, so this would have been sometime in the first few years of my life, before I turned 4. Back then, we were living in a place we later moved out of, and some of the things that happened there stayed with my family long after I was old enough to understand the stories. I wish I had a clear memory of it, because maybe then I could explain what I saw, or at least what I thought I saw. But I do not. All I have are the pieces my family gave me and the strange things that were discovered later, many years after the fact. One of the stories happened when I was being pulled in my trolley near some woods. I was only a small child, too young to explain myself properly. My parents or grandparent were with me, taking me along close to the tree line. I imagine it as one of those quiet walks where the adults were not expecting anything unusual. Just a child in a trolley, a path, some woods nearby, and an ordinary day. Then I pointed into the trees. Or maybe I waved. The story was told in both ways, but the important part was always the same. I reacted to something in the woods. The adults looked where I was pointing, but they saw nobody there. No person standing between the trees, no child hiding in the brush, no old man walking away, nothing, just woods. To them it was strange, but maybe not shocking at first. Children wave at random things all the time. They point at shadows, birds, sunlight, leaves, or things adults do not notice. A very young child might laugh at a tree stump or stare at an empty corner. If that had been the only thing that ever happened, maybe no one would have thought much of it. But they remembered it because of what came later. About 20 years after that walk, it was discovered that there had been a hidden, very old cemetery in those woods. It had been forgotten for a long time. The graves were not obvious to people passing by. It was not some clean, marked graveyard with a gate and paths and flowers. It had been lost under time, hidden by the trees and growth, forgotten by the people living nearby. And that was exactly the place I had been pointing or waving toward when I was too young to know anything about it. That discovery made my family look back at that moment differently. Before anyone knew about the cemetery, maybe I was just waving at nothing. Afterward, it became harder to dismiss. What was I seeing there? Who was I waving at? Was I pointing at a place I somehow sensed? Or was there someone among those old graves that only I could see? I do not know. I do not remember. But the adults who were there believed it meant something. The second story is even more personal because it happened inside the room where I slept. When I was very little, my family said they sometimes heard me talking in my room when I was alone. Not just making baby noises or talking to toys in the simple way children do. I was speaking as if someone was there with me. I would talk about my friend, a young boy. That was the detail they remembered. I was not talking about an imaginary animal or a pretend parent or some nameless figure. I had a friend in that room, and I described him as a young boy. Again, children have imaginary friends. That is the first and most reasonable explanation. Lots of children talk to people who are not there. They invent playmates, create little worlds, and speak out loud to things adults cannot see because those things exist only in the child's imagination. If a child says there is a friend in the room, most people smile and think it is normal childhood fantasy. But later, the landlord told my family something that changed the story. He said that in that very room, before I was born, a young boy had died from some sickness. It had happened in the 1960s. I was born in 1972, so this was before my time. I had no way of knowing about it. I was too little to understand things like death, old tenants, sickness, or the history of a room. No one had told me a boy had died there. As far as anyone knew, I could not have learned that information from anywhere. And yet, when I was alone in that room, I talked to a young boy. That is the part my family could not explain away. Maybe it was still just imagination. Maybe I invented a young boy as a friend, and the landlord's story was just a strange coincidence. Coincidences happen. Children often imagine other children because that makes sense to them. A little child is more likely to create a child friend than an adult one. So maybe there was nothing more to it than that, but when you put the stories together, they begin to feel different. A toddler points or waves into empty woods where a forgotten old cemetery is discovered 20 years later. The same child talks to a young boy in a room where a young boy had died years before the child was born. The adults see no one, but the child reacts as if someone is there. The child is too young to lie in a detailed way, too young to have learned the hidden history, too young to understand why any of it would be strange. That is why my parents and grandparents were sure I saw ghosts. I sometimes wish I could remember even a little piece of it. I wonder what the woods looked like to me. Did I see people standing among the trees? Did I see one person near the old cemetery? Was I waving because someone waved first? Was it a child, an old woman, a man, or just a shape I did not understand? Or did I simply feel drawn to that place for reasons no one could explain? And in my room, I wonder about the boy. What did he look like to me? Did I know his name? Did he talk back? Did he play with me? Did I see him sitting on the floor, standing near the bed, or waiting in a corner? Was he kind? Was he lonely? Did he know he was dead? Or was he only a feeling, a presence that my young mind turned into a friend because I did not know what else to call him? Those questions have no answers. The adults never got more than what a small child could tell them. Maybe I said enough for them to understand I believed I had a friend, but not enough to explain who he was. Maybe they asked me questions and I answered in the simple, scattered way children do. Maybe I forgot him as soon as we moved away. That may be the strangest part. Whatever I saw, if I saw anything at all, did not stay with me as a memory. It belonged to those early years, up to around the age of 4, and then we moved out. After that, the experiences stopped, at least as far as I know. That makes me wonder if it was connected to the place. Some people believe children are more open to things adults cannot see. Maybe because they have not yet been taught what is impossible. Maybe because their minds are not closed off by logic and fear in the same way. Maybe because they do not question a figure at the edge of the woods or a boy in the bedroom. They simply accept what is in front of them. If someone is there, they wave. If someone wants to talk, they talk back. Then they grow older, and that openness fades. I do not know if I believe that fully, but my family did after what happened with me. From their side, they saw a pattern. They saw me respond to people who were not there. They saw me talk about a young boy in my room. They later learned that there had been a young boy who died in that same room before I was born. They remembered me pointing into woods that later turned out to hide an old cemetery. For them, the conclusion was obvious. I had seen the dead. For me, it is more complicated because I do not remember it. It is strange to have ghost stories about yourself that feel almost like stories about another person. The child in the trolley, waving at the woods, is me, but I cannot remember being that child. The little one talking to a boy alone in the room is me, but I do not remember the boy. I only know the story because people who loved me told it, and because later details seem to support what they believed. That gives the story a strange feeling. It is not like remembering a ghost at the foot of the bed or hearing a voice in a hallway. It is more like being told that, before you were old enough to understand the world may have shown you something hidden, and everyone else remembers your reaction, but you do not. Maybe that is why it feels so haunting to me now. Not because I remember fear, but because I remember nothing. If I did see something, it has been erased from my mind. The people, the boy, the cemetery, the woods, all of it is gone from my own memory. But the adults remembered, and the facts that came later made the stories hard for them to ignore. The old cemetery is especially strange because no one knew about it at the time. If it had been a known graveyard, then maybe I had seen headstones or heard adults mention it. But it was hidden and forgotten. It was only discovered about 20 years later. That means when I pointed or waved into those woods, nobody around me understood why that place mattered. They only found out much later that the area had a history with the dead, and the bedroom story has the same kind of feeling. A young boy had died there in the 1960s. I was born in 1972. I spoke to a young boy in that room before I was 4 years old. Those facts sit too close together to feel completely random. Still, I try to leave room for doubt. Memory from adults can change over time. Maybe the stories were shaped by later discoveries. Maybe when the old cemetery was found, my family remembered the moment in the woods more strongly than it deserved. Maybe when the landlord mentioned the boy who died in the room, they connected it to my imaginary friend, and the connection became more mysterious in hindsight. People are meaning-making creatures. We look for patterns. We tie events together. Sometimes we create a story where there was only coincidence. That is possible. But I also know that my parents and grandparent were sure. They were the ones who saw me at the time. They were the ones who heard me talking. They were the ones who watched me point or wave at an empty part of the woods. They knew what had happened before the later discoveries gave those moments meaning, and they were convinced that I had been seeing something real. I think about that young boy sometimes. If he was real, if some part of him remained in that room, then maybe. I was not scared of him because he was not trying to frighten me. Maybe he was simply a child too, lonely, and still attached to the place where he had died. Maybe I was young enough to notice him, and young enough not to be afraid. To a small child, another child in the room might not seem strange. It might seem like a friend. That thought is sad more than scary. The cemetery in the woods feels sad too. An old forgotten burial place, hidden by trees, unseen by the living for years. If there were spirits there, maybe they were not trying to frighten anyone either. Maybe they were just there, tied to the place where their bodies had been left, and I was little enough to see or sense them. Maybe when I pointed or waved, I was simply acknowledging someone everyone else had forgotten. Of course, maybe there was nothing there at all. Maybe I waved at shadows and invented a friend, and the rest was coincidence. But my family never believed that. They believed I saw ghosts until we moved away. They believed it happened only during those early years, before I was 4, while we were living in that place. After we left, the stories stopped. No more waving at empty woods. No more talking to a boy alone in my room. No more little signs that I was seeing someone beyond the living. I do not know whether moving away ended it because I grew out of it, or because the place itself was the reason it happened. Maybe both. I only know the story that was given to me. When I was very young, my family saw me react to things they could not see. Near the woods, I pointed or waved into an empty place that later turned out to hide a very old forgotten cemetery. In my room, I talked to a young boy, and later the landlord told my family that a young boy had died in that same room from sickness in the 1960s, before I was even born. I have no memory of any of it, but my parents and grandparent remembered, and they were sure I had seen ghosts. My in-laws had 3 dogs, and because of the way the dogs ate, one of them had to be fed separately from the other 2. That was just part of the routine in their house. Anyone who has had multiple dogs knows meals can get complicated. One dog eats too fast, one gets pushy, one tries to steal, one guards food, and suddenly, dinner for the animals has to be managed like a small military operation. So to keep things calm, they fed 2 of the dogs in the dining room area next to the kitchen, and the 3rd dog got his food upstairs. His dish was placed up the stairs from the kitchen, in the bedroom hallway. It was not right at the top of the stairs. It was on a carpeted surface, pushed up against the wall, about 4 feet away from the steps. That detail matters, because it was not balanced on the edge of anything. It was not sitting on tile where it could slide. It was not near the staircase where one small bump could send it falling. It was on carpet, against the wall, away from the stairs. After the dogs ate, they did what dogs always do. They finished their food and immediately came to the dinner table to beg from us. All 3 of them were there with us. The 2 that had eaten downstairs came over from the dining room area, and the one that had been fed upstairs had come back down too. By the time we sat down to have dinner, all 3 dogs were gathered near the table, staring at us with that dramatic starving dog look, even though they had just eaten. It was a normal family dinner. Nothing felt strange at first. We were sitting around the dining room table, eating and talking, with the kitchen right beside us and the stairwell visible through it. The layout of the house made the line of sight important. From the dining room table, you could look through the kitchen and see toward the stairs. It was not like the stairwell was hidden behind a corner or down some hallway where we could not see what was happening. If someone had come down the stairs, we would have seen them. If one of the dogs had run up or down, we would have known. All 3 dogs were at the table. No one was upstairs. About 5 minutes after we had started eating, we heard a sudden loud hit from the stairs. It was sharp and hard enough that every person at the table turned immediately. The sound had that unmistakable quality of something solid striking the steps. It did not sound like something slowly sliding or gently tipping over. It sounded like an object had been launched or thrown with force. We all looked toward the kitchen and stairwell at almost the exact same time. Then, the dog dish came flying down the stairs. It hit hard enough to bounce off the steps, then continued through the kitchen and into the dining room. It traveled maybe 25 feet total. That was not a little fall. It was not a bold tumbling 1 or 2 stairs and stopping. It came down with momentum, bouncing and clattering, crossing the kitchen, and ending up all the way in the dining room where we were sitting. For a second, nobody said anything. We were all staring at it. The dogs were still right there at the table with us. All 3 of them. That was the first thing everyone's brain checked, because it was the obvious explanation. A dog must have done it. One of them must have gone upstairs, knocked the bowl down, and come running back. But that did not work. They had all been at the table the whole time, begging. We had seen them. They were not upstairs. None of them had left the room. The next thought was a person. Maybe someone was upstairs and had knocked it down, or maybe someone had thrown it as a joke. But nobody was upstairs. We were all downstairs at the table. There were no guests hidden in the house, no kid playing around, no person who could have picked up the dish and sent it flying. The stairwell was in view. If someone had been there, we would have known. Then there was the position of the dish before it moved. It had been left on carpet in the bedroom hallway, pushed against a wall about 4 feet away from the stairs. Even if it had somehow tipped, it should not have moved toward the staircase on its own. Carpet does not let things slide easily, especially not a dog dish sitting against a wall. It would have needed to move several feet across carpet, change direction toward the steps, and then go down the stairs with enough speed to bounce and travel through the kitchen into the dining room. That is not something a bowl does by itself. A vibration could not explain it. A draft could not explain it. The house settling could not explain it. A dog could not explain it. A person could not explain it. Even if the bowl had somehow been resting at an angle, which it was not, it still would not have launched itself from a carpeted hallway and traveled 25 feet. There was no chain of ordinary events that made sense, and yet it had happened right in front of us. That was the strange part. A lot of weird stories happen when someone is alone, or half asleep, or looking the other way. This was different. There were multiple people sitting at the table. We all heard the first impact. We all turned. We all saw the dish come down the stairs and continue through the kitchen into the dining room. It was not something one person could misremember or exaggerate. We all witnessed the same impossible thing, and nobody had an explanation. The reaction was almost funny because it was so understated. You might think everyone would scream, jump up, search the house, or start panicking. But instead, after that first stunned moment, The general feeling was just, well, then. There was nothing else to say. We had all seen it. We all knew the dogs were at the table. We all knew nobody was upstairs. We all knew where the dish had been placed. We all knew it should not have been able to do what it did. So after a moment, we basically accepted that something weird had happened and went back to eating. That may sound strange, but sometimes that is how people react to something they cannot explain. If the event is too bizarre and too brief, your brain does not know where to put it. There is no follow-up, no ghostly figure at the stairs, no voice, no second object flying across the room. Just one dog dish that moved in a way it should not have moved. Once it stopped, the house was quiet again. Dinner was still on the table. The dogs were still begging. Life continued. But I have never been able to explain it. I have gone over the details because they are so specific. The bowl was upstairs, on carpet, against a wall away from the stairs. All 3 dogs were downstairs at the table. Everyone else was downstairs too. The dining room had a direct line of sight through the kitchen to the stairwell. We all turned when we first heard the bowl hit. It came down with force, bounced off the steps, crossed the kitchen, and went into the dining room. It traveled far enough and hard enough that it could not have simply fallen. The force is what bothers me most. A bowl falling is one thing. A bowl being thrown is another. This looked and sounded like the second one. It had energy behind it. It moved like something had pushed it hard, or picked it up and hurled it down the stairs. But there was nothing there to do that. Not a dog, not a person, not anything we could see. And the dogs did not provide an explanation either. If one of them had caused it, they would not have been standing at the table the whole time. If something upstairs had startled them, maybe they would have reacted differently. But they were already downstairs with us. They had no chance to be part of it. Their presence at the table, which was usually just annoying because they were begging, became the proof that none of them could have done it. That is why everyone noticed immediately. If even one dog had been missing, we might have blamed that dog without thinking too hard. Dogs are chaos. They knock things over, drag things around, and create weird messes. A dish falling down the stairs could easily be blamed on a dog if a dog had been upstairs. But all 3 were in plain sight. That removed the easiest explanation right away. The house itself did not help either. Some houses have strange noises, uneven floors, drafts, or loose fixtures. But again, this was not a creak or a door moving. This was an object that started in a stable spot and ended up across the house. The floor was carpeted. The dish was against the wall. The distance to the steps was about 4 feet. There was no natural path for it to take. It would have had to move on purpose. That is the sentence I keep coming back to, even though I do not like it. It moved like something meant to send it down the stairs. I do not know what that something would be. I am not saying it was a ghost. I am not saying there was a spirit in the house who did not like dinner being peaceful. I do not have a big haunting story attached to it. There was no dark history I know of, no dramatic pattern of activity that led up to it, no warning. It was just one strange event that happened in an ordinary house during an ordinary meal. But sometimes one event is enough. It is almost easier when a place is obviously creepy. If you are in an old abandoned building or a hotel with a reputation, part of you expects strange things. Your mind is already prepared to be scared. But when something impossible happens during dinner, surrounded by family and dogs, it feels more unsettling in a different way. It invades the normal world. It says the weirdness does not need darkness, silence, or a scary setting. It can happen while everyone is sitting at the table with food in front of them. That is what made it so memorable. We were not trying to contact anything. We were not telling ghost stories. We were not half asleep. We were not outside in the woods or exploring an abandoned place. We were having dinner. The dogs had finished eating and were begging at the table. The upstairs hallway was empty. Then a dog dish came flying down the stairs like someone had thrown it. There was no build-up and no explanation afterward. Just the sound, the movement, the shock, and then the quiet. I sometimes think about what would have happened if only one person had seen it. They probably would have been dismissed. Someone would have said the dog did it, or the bowl slid, or they were confused about where it started. But because all of us were there, no one could easily deny it. We all had the same basic reaction because we all knew the same facts. No dog, no person. Bowl an impossible spot. Bowl comes flying down anyway. The funny thing is, our reaction of going back to eating almost makes the story feel more real to me. Nobody tried to turn it into a dramatic performance. Nobody screamed about ghosts. We did not spend the whole night making up theories. We just recognized that something deeply weird had happened, had no answer for it, and continued with dinner because what else were we supposed to do? Sometimes the mind chooses normal routine as protection. If you stop and really think about what you just saw, you may have to accept that something in the house did something you cannot explain. That is uncomfortable. So you say, well then, pick up your fork and keep eating. It is almost a way of telling yourself that reality is still stable, even if a dog dish just broke the rules for a few seconds. But the rules were broken. A dish on carpet, against a wall, 4 feet from the stairs, should not launch itself down hard enough to bounce off steps and travel through 2 rooms. All 3 dogs should not be able to cause it while standing in front of us. No one upstairs should not be able to throw something. And yet it happened. I still do not know what moved that dish. Maybe there is some freak explanation involving a vibration, an angle, a hidden slope, and perfect timing, but I have never been able to make that work in my head. The physical setup was too wrong for that. The distance was too far. The force was too much. The witnesses were too many. So the story remains simple and strange. We were at my in-laws' house having dinner. Their 3 dogs had finished eating and were begging at the table. One dog's dish had been left upstairs in the hallway on carpet, against the wall, several feet from the steps. No one was upstairs. Then, about 5 minutes later, that dish came flying down the staircase, bounced hard, shot through the kitchen, and made it into the dining room. We all saw it. We all knew it could not have happened the way it did. And after a moment, because none of us had anything better to say, we basically said, well then, and went back to eating.